The Norn9 franchise has a long history. It's one of Otome's most popular Otome game franchises, having originally began life as a PSP release quite late into its life cycle. Norn9, Norn and Nornet, as it was known at the time, was a successful release, and would later go on to be ported to multiple platforms including the PS Vita and Nintendo Switch, with the name Var Commons. 2 fan discs were later released for the game in Japan, Last Era and Actune, as well as lots of merchandise. It was one of the first works of the writer Ushio Ayan, having already written Juzengi and later on the Even If Tempest games. In terms of the Western world, we first got Norn9 Var Commons localised on the PS Vita back in 2015, as well as the anime adaptation. It was one of the first non-Hakoki Otome game localizations we got from Axis Games and Idea Factory, and it came around the same time as Amnesia and Code Realize. It was largely forgotten about, given that Code Realize took most of the spotlight, both on the Vita and on the Switch. We got the fan discs for Code Realize for those consoles first, but now it's Norn9's time to shine. It was also one of the Otome games I played on the PS Vita, and although I didn't play it until years after it originally came out, when I did, it became one of my favourite Otome games to date. I found its world to be really captivating and intriguing, accompanied by beautiful art and music. Until recently, it was one of the few games I'd recommend getting a PS Vita for. It was even number 3 in my top 10 Vita games video I did last year. Go watch that please. This was because even though the game was ported to Switch in Japan in a bundle pack alongside Last Era back in 2019, known as Norn9 Lothen, it wasn't localised for the West. Of course that's since changed as Axis announced they would bring in Norn9 back to the West, dating Var Commons with an improved localisation and bringing Last Era West for the first time as separate releases. So I've decided to take this opportunity to replay the game and do a retrospective on it, as well as check out Last Era for the first time. It is one of the most anticipated 2023 releases after all. Is this game just as good as I remember, and if so, what about it makes it so special? How this is going to work is that this video is going to be a retrospective of Var Commons with some very light spoilers, mostly relating to trigger warnings. Any heavy spoiler discussion I will save for the Last Era video when that game comes out later this year. Yep, I'm already committing to creating a Last Era video. This is also partially because Norn9 Var Commons is known for having plot holes that are addressed in the fan disc, so certain aspects of this world's story won't be explored or discussed here, likewise detailed discussion of certain events in the story. Also, I won't be discussing the second fan disc, Actune. First off, it's not on Switch, and it's not localised, because apparently it is a load of wank, so we can pretend it doesn't exist. Also, I don't personally consider these spoilers, but others will, but in the background during the gameplay there will be some CGs at times. Not many, but if that bothers you, consider listening to the audio only, you will still get the full experience. With all this said, let's get started. So even though this is a visual video, I'm not going to start this section with a game synopsis, and the reason why will become clear enough. I'm going to touch on a setting first, and the way I can describe it is a combination of science fiction and historical fiction with elements of fantasy incorporated within. The core of the setting you experience throughout the game is on a ship called the Norn. It looks like something that could come out of a fantasy RPG, but is very much rooted in the real world, like there are streets, functional kitchens, a beautiful freshwater waterfall with its own rainbow, as well as its own forest. You also get to see cute birds of all kinds called Hyokos on board, which are basically this world's equivalent of the chocobos from the Final Fantasy series. It's not something you'd not conventionally associate as being on a ship, which greatly helps build its unique atmosphere. When you're not on the ship, you are on the ground in typical grassland desert settings, or you're in towns resemble the early 20th century, complete with electricity pylons that resemble the average Western European streets. In some ways it feels like a trip back in time. That said, this is a world that has its own problems. It's a world where conflicts and skirmishes are happening, so you must be on your guard whenever you're not on the ship. It's also a world that is literally ruled by the World, an organisation shrouded in mystery and those who gave you your mission. You, aka the main cast, which I'll come on to, are on a journey to discover a destination that you do not know the identity of, and it's absolutely vital that you must complete your mission. All of this comes together to create an intriguing setting that has a lot of promise and is immediately engaging to anyone who reads about it. It's not surprising it's been so successful. But back to the Norn though, and its character cast. On the ship is the cast of characters, 3 girls 8 guys, 1 boy, and a lot of birds. And you can play as 4 of them. I'm getting ahead of myself a bit, so I'm going to go back into the structures and characters a bit more. The structure is a key aspect of this game that I need to touch on now before I elaborate on the characters any further, and this is because it's important to understand the complexity of the story. When you start the game, you play as Sarata. Now Sarata is very different from the typical character you play as in Otome games, as he is a 12-year-old child prodigy. After going to the Tokyo Diet Building on a school trip, he hears a mysterious song, and in the process gets sucked into the world of Norn9. As at this point he meets the core cast of Norn9, joins the Norn and begins to get involved with this cast of characters. What also makes Sarata a unique perspective is that his interactions with the cast are purely platonic, but his perspective is critical to the story. I also think it means a lot of people overlook him. He's a very logically minded character who refuses to believe what he sees at first, but there's a charm about it that makes him a memorable character. It's quite typical not just of kids to tell it like it is, but also child prodigies in general, especially when those characterizations are combined. I'm not surprised Otome did a good job at characterizing him as they've done this before. For example, one of their most popular games is Clock Zero, where that game features a core cast of 12-year-old characters who go to school together, and at night they end up part of the same dream world where they're aged 10 years older. So they have experience in this. And yeah, I wanted an excuse to talk about Clock Zero again, so sorry for the deviation! Or more like, thank you for the deviation. I should also add that Sarata is, because he's a boy, there's obviously the gender dynamic change there, so we don't play as guys in Otome games normally, aside from the occasional perspective shift, whereas here, no, Sarata is a core character. So speaking of changing characters, early on in the prologue you get to a choice where, following the choice you select, the game shifts into 3 perspectives, or as they're called, paths. Each path corresponds to one of the 3 women on the Norn. They are Koharu, Mikoto and Nanami, who each have 3 guys each they can romance, and once you've completed the happy ends of all 9 guys, you can then return to the prologue and select a 4th choice, and this leads to the epilogue ending of Var Commons, and in many ways it's kind of poetic that you start your journey as Sarata and then you end your journey as Sarata. So now I'm going to talk about each female character a bit, as well as the guys they can romance. I'll go by each girl on the order you can see them on the select screen, and then talk about each guy factoring the recommended route order. Yes, there is a recommended route order, and deviating from this path does lead for spoilers. I will spoil a few light details, but relate mostly to trigger warnings, though I will have a full trigger warning list near the end. It's also worth mentioning the early event in the story that leads to people getting put into pairs, and an opportunity for love to blossom. An early event occurs where the ship is attacked by a man in a floating capsule wielding a gun. And a gun is something that most people on board the Norn are entirely unfamiliar with. And during the process, it's quickly established that one person on board the Norn is a traitor, which adds a sense of tension and mystery to an otherwise, well, it's quite an idyllic and tranquil lifestyle. Hence, you are put into pairs with other people to decrease the opportunities for the traitor to act, so you can monitor each other better. And this is when you pick your partner, and that dictates what route you are put onto. First off, I love Koharu as a character. She has this combination of being really sweet and wholesome, but also sheltered and isolated, having been away from most people for most of her life. She's one of the last people to join the Norn, with her finding Sarata and taking him on board during the prologue. Because she's one of the last to board the ship, it's interesting to see how she integrates into the cast, given many of the others have already made friends and know each other a bit. Her power is an offensive, pyrokinetic based fire power, and it's something she deeply dislikes and is scared to show to others. It's generally recommended to play as her first because 2 of her routes, namely Kakeru and Senri, are part of the recommended route order. Kakeru's route is one of, if not the first, route you should play early on, as his route also serves a lot to understand the wider world of Norn9, as well as the dynamics on the ship. It is vital from a plot perspective, basically. Kakeru as a person, though, he's kind of questionable. He's very much one of the leaders of the group aboard the Norn, and it does show. However, he can come across as a bit of a bully and a bit obnoxious at times. The game suggests he deliberately acts this way to describe his care for others, and I'm gonna be honest, I really struggled to click with it. Especially because he's very nice to Koharu in her routes, but not so nice in general outside of that. Senri is the embodiment of the hikikomori trope, which is something you don't really see much of in VNs that aren't heavily rooted into otaku culture in Japan. So yeah, this VN is not a science adventure game, this is very much different. His route is wholesome as you see him slowly begin to come out of his shell, participate with the group more, and especially with Koharu trying to accommodate him as best as she can. Although one thing I don't like is that his voice acting is often very quiet, meaning it's difficult to hear him in conversations compared to other voiceovers unless you turn the music off. The third character, Masamune, is locked and is recommended as one of the last routes you play. He is one of the oldest characters in the game and it shows in his confidence and his leadership. By extension, his power is also being able to contact the world directly, which is unique among the cast. I think you should do his route later in the game as there are certain aspects of his route story, especially in relation to other characters, that are better played after playing others first. As for Masamune himself, it is interesting to see how he interacts with Koharu and how much he cares about her. The dynamic is very much an older boyfriend alongside a younger girlfriend. Mikoto is the leadership figure out of the three girls. She very much fits the tsundere trope, but does have a very nice and caring side, especially with the other girls. That said, she takes protecting the rows around her very seriously, to a point where she's one of the ship's leaders as well. She also has the power to put magical barriers around something, which is vital for defending the Norn. She takes it so seriously even when it's detrimental to her. The workaholic trope is very strong. I liked her a lot as a character. Some of her dialogue can be a bit stuck up and bossy, mainly because of her background as being born to a rich family, but also so blunt it can be hilarious at times, especially when she's rejecting romantic advances from others, especially Itsuki. Sakuya is part of the recommended route order. Of her guys, you should play as him first. As the childhood friend love interest, of course this plays a critical role in his arc. Throughout their time on Norn, Mikoto and Sakuya are practically inseparable, especially in his route. He is very perceptive and kind of charming. He's also good at de-escalating potentially tricky situations between other characters. I liked him a lot, and personally I think he's one of the best routes in the game, but to explain why would lean into major spoiler territory, so I definitely recommend playing this for yourself. Itsuki is very much the flirtatious love interest who acts like an airhead at times. It can be a bit hard to deal with at first, like overly flirtatious guys in general who behave similar to the way Itsuki does is kind of like, yeah, I don't want to be around you, and it makes me uncomfortable. And the more you play his route though, the more you begin to understand how that's one part of his personality, and he's a lot more observant than he lets on, and of course quite caring. And this is something that you see down the route as Mikoto and the player begins to see this part of Itsuki, and then Mikoto becomes attracted to him. It's a great story of how opposites attract, and that was so sweet. And finally we have Natsuhiko, who is recommended to be the last route that you play in the game. He's basically the closest that you've got to an antagonist out of the 9 guys. He's basically against the world and by extension the Espers. I found his route really interesting because it's basically enemies to lovers done right, in that him and Mikoto become lovers, and there's also a lot of plot holes that are filled in when you play through his route, so that's another reason why you've got to play it last. In many ways it's quite different to the other routes, so I definitely recommend not playing his route first, or even anything other than last. Nanami is the third member of the girls and is the last trio of guys as well. She's generally quite a quiet person, quite timid and awkward, but is a good person. She has the kuderi trope, which I'm personally not super fond of. She has the power to wipe people's memories, and much like Koharu, she doesn't like or want to use this power. Her power has the most potential to really develop the story as a plot device, and I'm really pleased to say in that respect they each delivered. I love how in each of her routes and others, her memory wiping power is used to further develop the characters in unique ways, whether it's just the fact it's there or it's actually used. I really like that aspect of it. And on to the guys now. Haishi is part of the recommended route order, and out of all of the Nami's interests is definitely the one I recommend playing first. He has the power of telepathy and is extremely sensitive to knowing how others feel as a result, and he's generally more of the happy, positive vibe setter as a result. His route is also worth playing among the first, as there are no major plot spoilers for the overarching world. So if you wish to avoid spoilers for the overall world, this is definitely one to play first out of all of the recommended routes. Plus their relationship from friends to lovers is also extremely key as well. Akito is not part of the recommended route order, but his route's one to play later in the game. His route does have a lot of spoilers, so there's that to consider. As for Akito himself, he's a respected chef on board the Norn, and while he appears quite cold and bitter, especially towards Nanami, he's also quite nice. He does have elements of the Tundra trope, and I will say, without spoiling anything about the story, the more you understand Akito and the story he has, the more you warm up to him, and I loved his route by the end of it. He's essentially a guy with a very tough persona, but has a bit of a massive softie inside, which I thought was so cool. Ron is the last route you should play out of Nanami's batch. I'd argue play him before Natsuhiko. He's very much the trash love interest. He's absent-minded, doesn't seem to care about other people, and can be quite obnoxious and hard to interact with. He's not a good character, and him and Nanami have the biggest age gap of all the couples on board, which is also kinda yikes as well. One warning I will give about his route, which does lean into spoiler territory a bit. His route does have both a bad ending and a tragic love ending, and both of these can be quite distressing. And I would recommend caution if you plan to do Ron's route and only stick to the happy ending, or at least look up the trigger warnings first. His route does hold some value in it though, due to the surprising level of self-awareness he has about not just himself, but also his role in the world and story, and also because some of his dialogue with Nanami can be kind of funny because of just how just bizarre and out of place it is. It's just kind of weird. So yes, even garbage human beings can be entertaining, and also he is a very sexy pecs, just saying. As for the epilogue route I touched on earlier, this route basically finishes Sarata's story. It's much shorter than any of your routes, but it's also the simplest to complete as there are no choices after the one you select in the prologue. It's such a cute ending that is worth experiencing yourself, and that really helps flesh out Sarata's character. It goes to show how Sarata is just as important a protagonist as the three heroines, and it really does show here, and I love how Sarata was incorporated into the story in this way. The best way to remember this game's structure here is that it operates in threes. You have three heroines, each with three guides to romance, and three overarching stories. These overarching stories share a few common events, some of which can be skipped on repeat playthroughs. However, others are largely overarching events where the dialogue varies a bit more than just a few minor tweaks. There's also a broad conclusion of each story based on one of three scenarios. Keeping it as vague as possible, these three broad endings depend on whether you reach your destination because of events that take place during the story, and if you do, whether you meet certain requirements required to carry out your mission. Each ending also differs slightly per character, especially for those where you don't reach the destination. It's difficult to elaborate any more without spoiling anything, but if you've played one or two routes, you'll know what I'm getting at. So why I'm mentioning all these things? This is in part because one of the biggest strengths of Norn9 is how the story is very multi-layered, and how various things seemingly minor or irrelevant in one route ended up being fleshed out in another. It feels like you're in a very complex web of relationships between this closely knit cast that you will only fully understand once you've completed all the routes. This applies in both the more slice of life portion of the story, usually the first few chapters of each character arc, to the last couple of chapters where plot development of the overall world occurs during the conclusions to each of these characters' individual stories. Other aspects include how the shared scenes, both skippable and non-skippable, vary ever so slightly depending on the heroine you're playing as. It makes repeat playthroughs of these scenes interesting to read as each heroine's personality shows clearly throughout as the perspective shifts. Plus also the interactions between the girls in these scenes, especially when they talk about the guys they like, is really cute and heartwarming. This is not something commonly seen in Otome games because they usually only contain one heroine and maybe another side character, and it's really nice that it has this extra depth. As I mentioned in the beginning, Norn9 Var Commons is known for having some plot holes in its story. I love the science fiction setting, and it's so many original ideas that aren't fully explained, and personally I'm willing to overlook it for two reasons. Firstly, I want to see how Norn9 Last Era addresses the many plot holes, and secondly, I love the romance and the overall characters a lot, so these wider details can drift into the background a bit. In fact, at times I often didn't care about the wider settings because the immediate relationships between the cast members were so good and engrossing. I will admit though that replaying the game for me did make these few plot points missing more noticeable and annoying however, and I guess it goes to show how much flew over my head back then. Additionally, because there are 9 guides to romance, the routes are naturally a bit shorter. Personally, I prefer shorter routes compared to longer ones, so this is a positive in my book. Of course, many dislike shorter routes as character development can be rushed a bit, but because of how interlinked the roots are, this issue is reduced to a large extent. It's something that could only be done in a game as deeply interlinked as this. Overall, I love the stories, both for the individual characters and the wider world. And one final thing for stories before I move on to the trigger warnings are the Hyokos. They are, as I mentioned earlier, the equivalent of Final Fantasy's chocobos, and it is also cute seeing them interact with the cast and themselves, and they really help to lighten the mood of the game, especially on the Norn. It's also cute how their way of speaking are just bird sounds as well as one-line words of text like happy, confirmation, and angry. This is before mentioning the Hyoko TV segments, where they're kind of like optional segments you can get during the story, where you can view the characters interacting with each other and this Hyoko interviewing them, which is really cool. They're nice short little skits that break up the action a bit. And now onto trigger warnings. Most of these are limited to the bad and tragic love endings at the end of each route. Not all routes feature some of these, but some of them can, so let's get into them. I'm going to be brief to also minimise spoilers as well. General violence, death of major characters, which is mostly in the tragic love endings, however this also happens in Masamune's route regardless of the ending. Gun use, which is limited mostly to Natsuhiko as well as a traitor. Abuse, primarily verbal, but this is most pronounced in Ron's bad ending. Brainwashing and manipulation, mainly involving one particular character. Attempted stroke potential sexual assault, but nothing happens though, and a lot of the death also occurs off screen as well. Anyway, now onto the art and music. This is easily one of the highlights of the game and really helps create a captivating setting. The character art is done by Taita, who is known in the world of Otome games for illustrating Nightshade, the upcoming Charade Maniacs, and the recently released Tsukai Tenki from Otome's sister brand Altagear in Japan. I love her art so much, and Norn9 is a great showcase of it. As for the music, Nobuo Uematsu composed the main theme of the game, Arc of Destiny, World in the Norn. Yep, that legendary Nobuo Uematsu, known in the world of video games for the likes of Final Fantasy and various Mistwalker titles, including the most recently released Fantasian. It's a great opening theme that really helps immerse people into the world of Norn9, plus also, it makes pretty good brand recognition. And speaking of brand recognition, a lot of thing that people don't know is that literally every other track and an arrangement of the main game theme was composed by an Australian guy named Kevin Penkin. Yep, before he got his big break on Made in Abyss and various other big name video games and anime, he worked on niche Japanese games. And this isn't even his first Otome game. He had previously worked on the currently unlocalized Juzengui, also with Nobuo Uematsu, and also Ushio Ayane, which is really weird. But back to Norn9, I love Penkin's soundtrack. It's a great mix of science fiction and orchestrated music, and complements the unique atmosphere extremely well and is easy to highlight of the game from an audio perspective. Some of my favourite themes include Kobereru Hisashi and Hope to the Future, but all of them are great. It's no wonder he went on to compose so many iconic anime and games since. In many ways, he is the unsung hero of the game's soundtrack, and it's great that he was able to use this as a springboard for future success. Additionally, Yanagi Nagi sung the opening and ending vocals for the game, as well as the song first heard by Sarata, all of which are also great. The background art is done by Akiba Minoru, who is known as the art director for Rent-A-Girlfriend, Magical Girls Site, and the Pokemon movies. In the world of Otome games, he also worked on the more recent Even If Tempest from Voltage. The backgrounds are lovely. They have lots of colours and fit the atmosphere perfectly, especially on the Norn. Now on to localisation and miscellaneous features of the game. Now, first off, as many people know, the original Norn9 localisation from the days of the Vita wasn't the best. It was well known for having lots of translation errors, typos, and other indications that it was a localisation done on the cheap as part of Axis Games' long-running issues with Otome game QA. You know, the typical budget visual novel localisation. Well, the localisation was given a touch-up. Otome game veteran Ann Lee was hired to proofread this game and the upcoming Last Era to correct terminology and improve the localisation overall, to make it more consistent with the Japanese original. No more awkward kissing sounds, unfitting comparisons to snow, and much less typos as well. Overall clumsy wording. While the original localisation on the Vita was readable, as well. I enjoyed it, so I can verify that for myself. This version is so much better and far succeeds the original. At this point, I would recommend not even bothering with the Vita version unless it's literally the only thing you've got. The UI has also received a glow up for this Switch port. There are now options to skip directly to the next choice or chapter, which greatly helps with accessibility. If you hold ZL, you can open a new menu to quickly trigger certain settings, including the skip to next chapter option. I wholeheartedly recommend taking advantage of this. Weirdly, however, there are voice settings in the options for characters that appear in Last Era available in the settings, and this is likely a result of Var Commons and Last Era being split apart from the Norn9 Loffen pack into two separate releases, and I think this is more an issue on Otomate's part rather than Axie's. So if you're wary of Last Era spoilers in any form, you don't need to disable the voices, avoid the menu, so just leave the voices as they are. A couple of things I want to touch on are the bonus features. Most of them are locked behind the Norn9 store. As you play through more of the game and beat the happy endings, as well as find and watch all the Hyoko channel scenes, you can use the points to unlock various things, like mini episodes with each love interest, the audio player, and a mini comic strip. You will need to play mini episodes to unlock the final CG for each love interest, so it pays to look into this. If you don't have enough points, you can play Norn9 Quest, an 8-bit style game where you see the characters in pixel art form doing things. I'll be honest, I found this mode to be kind of boring and was probably the weakest part of the overall package, and I wouldn't bother with this at all, honestly, as there's no gameplay at all. The sprites do look very nice though, and it's really cool seeing places on the Norn rendered in pixel sprites reminiscent of 8 and 16-bit games. There's also Norn9 Ensemble, which is a mode where you can use the various keywords that you unlock throughout the game to make a conversation between all of the guys. This is another feature that I don't really care for myself, because there's not really much to it once you've unlocked everything, but it's nice to have, especially if you're into seiyus and you understand conversational Japanese, because there are no subs here. Finally, there are two more things I forgot to mention. The first is that the chibi art that you see for the ensemble and the CG gallery section are done by Satoi, who is very well known in the Otome game industry for the likes of Diabolic Lovers, Rebirthday Song, Oz Mafia. Second thing, as with the CG gallery, there was a feature added to the Vita version where you could press the prompts on screen so you can see them say various text, which to Axie's credit has been localized, and it's really nice and actually helps improve the experience. Looking back on Norn9, I really enjoyed revisiting it. It's a classic Otome game for a reason, and it's one I do recommend if you're looking for a plot-heavy visual with lots of romance scattered throughout. I'm so glad Axie's decided to bring it back to the West, because now a new generation of Otome fans can experience it on the Switch alongside many other classics, new and old. I'm looking forward to playing Last Era for the first time later this year, as I think it has a lot of potential to further expand on this amazing world, as well as answer the many plot holes Var Commons has. I think the other best way to describe Norn9 is that it's not about the journey you take, it's about the friends you make along the way and the connections you make. It's about understanding the world around you and how it all comes together, and it's about immersing yourself with all these interesting and memorable characters and living life with these people. And of course, falling in love with handsome guys. A unique route structure helps greatly to differentiate this from other Otome games and visual novels in general, and because of this, even if you're not into Otome games, I think you will appreciate the world it offers and what it tried to achieve, and the unique visual novel experience that it overall comes together to form. I overall definitely recommend getting this. Pick it up on sale if you're on the fence. Hopefully enjoy this great game as much as I did. Hello, and thank you for getting to the end of another Milla's Game Room retrospective video. I really enjoyed both making this video and playing Norn9. It's been nice to finally make a longer extended video for the channel about the game. I'm looking forward to doing the same for Norn9 Last Era in August, September time, as that was been dated, as I was putting the video together. Other thing is, I'm hoping to possibly do Jack Jian as a next visual novel feature. And as for non-visual novel features in terms of longer videos, I'm thinking Tears of the Kingdom, assuming I like that when it comes out. Yep, I'll be checking that game out. Let me know your thoughts. Have you played Norn9? Have you played similar games by Otome or other people involved, like say Nightshade, which is also great by the way. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, algorithm boosting stuff. Check the throne and coffee jars in the description if you are so inclined. Thank you so much and have a lovely day. Bye bye.